as I argue in Tolkien's modern reading, I think it gives us a much better understanding of how the Lord of the Rings is so powerful, because he's like a bridge between the medieval and the modern world. He's drawing lots of stuff from medieval literature, absolutely, but he's doing it and he's making it accessible and powerful, and he's transmuting it, he's transforming it. And he can do that precisely because he's engaged with modernity, he's reading modern literature, he's up to date on the news, he's interested in what's going on in the world.
Hello, welcome to And If Love Remains. This is your host, Mike Levitt, and I have on the line today somebody that I'm really excited to speak with. This is Dr. Holly Ordway. She is the Fellow of Faith and Culture of the Word on Fire Institute. She's a visiting professor at Houston Baptist University and holds a PhD in English from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She is the author of several books, including one that we're going to be talking mostly about today, which is Tolkien's Modern Readings, Middle-earth, Beyond the Middle Ages. And that will be coming out in January, and I'm very excited to talk about that. She is a published poet and a subject editor for the Journal of Inklings Studies. Her academic work focuses on the writings of the Inklings, and especially that of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, who will be the subject of our conversation today. Welcome to the show, Dr. Ordway.
Well, thank you for having me on.
It's my pleasure. Very quickly, I want to just spend a couple of minutes. I've been a long admirer of the Word on Fire Institute, and can you just tell me just very quickly what that is and what your role is there as the Fellow of Faith and Culture?
Well, as many of your viewers might have noticed, Word on Fire in general is ministry, Bishop Barron's ministry for evangelization, with a special focus for trying to reach the spiritually unaffiliated, the nones, N-O-N-E, and also Christians who just fallen away or never properly understood the faith. And the Word on Fire Institute is sort of what we might call a Catholic think tank. It's the educational branch of the Word on Fire movement. It's relatively new. It's only 2 years old. And so we've already done a lot with providing courses and materials. It's a subscription-based program. People get courses, events, lots of material just for being formed as Catholics, as Christians, and with the goal to really equip a whole army of people to go out there, and fight the good fight for sharing the gospel. And so my role as Fellow of Faith and Culture is to be writing, to be speaking, to be developing courses, and especially as the Fellow of Faith and Culture for engaging with culture and helping people to see the way that we can, be reading the culture, understanding what our culture is like and what people's questions really are so that we can answer them better. Part of the focus of my work for years has been to say, we have to understand what people's questions are before we can properly answer them. And also, to engage, find ways to, present the truth of the faith in a way that's engaging. And my literary critical work, on for instance, Lewis, the other Inklings, and Tolkien, is really, in line with this, because those, devout Christians whose work really has helped so many people, including myself, to be interested in the question of Christianity, and then from there to ask the necessary question, could it be true? And then discover, yes, it actually is true.
Right.
So this book that we're talking about it isn't an apologetics book at all. It's a literary critical book, but I think it's adjacent. It's in line with that whole vision of trying to engage culture as Christians in a thoughtful way.
And I really have appreciated that about Word on Fire. And as a non-Catholic, I can truly appreciate the cultural apologetics, I guess you would say, that you guys do and have done. I've been following Bishop Barron's work, and I've been really impressed with all the people that have been associated with the Institute. So I did not know that when I contacted you first. So it's a pleasure to know that as well. And let's dive a little bit into Tolkien. I mean, he is such an icon. There are very few authors that you can say, there's before Tolkien and after Tolkien. I mean, he like everything after Tolkien, especially in the fantasy genre and things like that, but everything written, he has like a shadow role in it in one form or another. So let's talk about Tolkien, maybe a little bit who he was, and maybe why his writing really does resonate to this day with us.
Well, I think most people will recognize Tolkien as the author of The Lord of the Rings, and then also of The Hobbit. The Hobbit was written first, and then The Lord of the Rings came about as the sequel to The Hobbit. His publishers asked him to write, a follow-up volume because The Hobbit had been so amazingly successful. And so for a while, he worked on what was called The New Hobbit. And then eventually it became a darker, more mature, much more complex book over more than 10 years that became what we now have as The Lord of the Rings. And he also, he spent his entire life writing masses and masses of stories, in addition to all of his academic work, because he was a professor of English literature, medieval literature, and language. And he wrote this entire, what's called the Legendarium, some of which was published after his death as the Silmarillion, and other sections of it have been published in the years since then by the late Christopher Tolkien, his son, who brought out books like The Fall of Gondolin, Baron Luthien, books like that. Again, from this massive stock of writing that Tolkien did and fiddled with for decades, trying to make it perfect and not publishing it. He was the great procrastinator for publishing. He was a total perfectionist. So we're quite lucky that we have Lord of the Rings at all. And indeed, Tolkien acknowledged a great debt, what he called the unpayable debt, to his friend C.S. Lewis, because it was Lewis's persistence and encouragement that got The Lord of the Rings published. If it weren't for Lewis, it would probably still be being polished in manuscript up until the very day of his death.
Right. Wow. And it's funny because Tolkien and Lewis are so tied at the hip. I mean, in some ways, we would not have very much of Lewis as he is without Tolkien and their friendship.
Yeah, I mean, they had a very long-standing friendship, all through Lewis's life. He died 10 years before Tolkien did. And Tolkien had a profound influence on Lewis's conversion to Christianity. Because Tolkien was a devout Catholic all of his life. And so when Lewis met him, Lewis was at that point not a believer at all, and was going through this process of, gradually having kind of philosophical conversion and accepting theism, and then still, not convinced about Christianity. And it was in the famous Addison's Walk conversation where Tolkien really put the case for the Christ story being both a profound myth, a profound, meaningful story, and something that really happened in history. That's the great both and of Christianity that Tolkien really grasped, I think, very, very beautifully. And he shared that with Lewis, and that was pivotal for Lewis then becoming a Christian. So in a way, we could almost say that Tolkien's kind of the godfather of books like Mere Christianity.
Right. Oh, yeah, that's fabulous. So I guess the debt is paid both ways in a sense. So who is Tolkien as far as his professional work? Because I think that's really important to understand, even his fiction. Like who was he? What did he work on? What were his passions?
Well, he would have called himself fundamentally a philologist, which is someone who studies the origins of language. And he worked in medieval literature, focusing on Old English and its development, Old English, Middle English. So his scholarly work is very much in that area of of early Middle English texts. And he was extremely, he was a world class scholar in that area. I mean, his work alone brought the Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf into its current present place of honor, because we think of Beowulf, oh, that's a famous poem, people study it in school.
Right.
Well, Tolkien was the one who pretty much dragged it out of obscurity where it had been pretty much ignored, and said this is a really important piece of literature in its own right, in this famous essay called Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics. And he just completely changed the course of scholarship on Beowulf. And that's just him in his professional life. So he would be a significant figure even if he had never written a word of fiction. But it turns out that because he was such an absolute genius, a tremendously fruitful, creative mind, that from his earliest youth, he was inventing languages. He was drawing and painting. He was also a visual artist, although people tend not to realize that.
Huh.
And writing poetry, writing stories, and and that out of that great creativity comes what ultimately he's most famous for, which is his creative work. Now,
Right.
since his academic work was primarily in medieval literature, that has led a lot of people to assume, quite wrongly, that that was the only thing that he cared about. There's a really mistaken but very very sticky idea that Tolkien was just stuck in the past, like he lived in the Middle Ages.
Yes, I've heard this.
Yeah, and that was really what I set out to investigate when it came to do this book, and to find out, is that actually true? And discovering, well, no, it's not. It's
Okay,
not.
so let's talk about that for a second. We're talking with Dr. Holly Ordway, the author of Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle Earth Beyond the Middle Ages. There it will be coming out this January in 2021, and there will be links to pre-orders in the show notes, as well as to the sites where you can receive that. But let's talk a little bit about that misgiving, and what were you trying to solve? What picture were you trying to find out with your book?
Well, this project has been an absolute voyage of discovery, because I've been working on Tolkien for decades. He's somebody who's been at this really center of my literary critical work ever since I was doing my PhD, and which I did on modern fantasy. And
In
after,
fact, if you don't mind, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to go back a little bit. Like where, and I meant to do this. How did you first discover Tolkien, and how did that become your passion, where you decided to do your doctorate on him, and like how did that happen?
well, I don't even know exactly when I first started reading Tolkien, because it was so long ago. I was a little girl and encountered the Hobbits, and then read the Lord of the Rings, and they were just part of my early reading, and I loved them, along with the Chronicles of Narnia. They just became part of the kind of furniture of my imagination. So I
Mm-hmm.
really loved those stories, and it was Tolkien who got me interested in the wider genre of fantasy, and how did fantasy work? Because I encountered, actually as a teenager, his essay on fairy stories, in which he looks at, well, what is fantasy? How does it work? Where does it come from? So that got me interested pretty early on with the question of where does the Lord of the Rings fit amongst other kinds of books, of his own day and of before. And I started reading some of those earlier ones, reading George MacDonald and William Morris a little bit, Lord Dunsany, even as a teenager. Um, and then I went off and began to get my degrees in English. My when I first started my graduate studies, actually, I was going to be a medievalist, again, kind of influenced by Tolkien.
Right.
But then I decided that I did, in fact, want to work on contemporary literature. So when I did my PhD, I focused it on modern fantasy. So it wasn't just on Tolkien, it was on modern fantasy as a genre. I wanted to kind of trace its development. Where did it come from? What is it like? But Tolkien, as you noted at the beginning, is such a pivotal figure. He basically transforms the entire genre of fantasy. Nobody can avoid reckoning with him. And indeed, I think in some ways you can argue that he hasn't had a good effect on fantasy in general, because everybody has been drawn into either imitating him or trying to fight against him.
Right.
And it's created a lot, I think, of creative tension, because his work was so amazing. So I did my dissertation on that, and that was all well and good. I went on, began my academic, my teaching career, and I just kept coming back sort of mentally to that question of, well, okay, I have a better sense now of the context of The Lord of the Rings, because I had been researching the history of the genre. And I thought to myself, well, I wonder, of those early fantasy novels, I wonder if Tolkien had read them. I wonder if he knew them. I knew that he knew some of them, but I started to wonder, had he read a lot of these contemporary fantasy authors, and what did he think of them? So I set out to research that. And then I started to realize, actually, I should look at what he had read more broadly of modern literature, because the more that I started digging into it, the more that I found that he had read. And I began to realize that it helped to start to answer a question that I had long had, which is, how do you account for the power of The Lord of the Rings?
Yeah.
Because it's such a powerful book. It speaks just so directly to the concerns and themes of the 20th century, the 21st century: power, dominion, technology, the misuse of technology, all of these things. And now
we're definitely even reckoning with today. I mean, it's still so poignant to talk about.
Absolutely. I mean, it's an utterly relevant, to the moment relevant book. And I've studied medieval literature. I love medieval literature. It's wonderful. But it began to kind of be borne upon me that you couldn't account for this power of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit just by positing that he's drawing all of his inspiration from medieval sources, which is what I think most people typically assume. They think he's a medievalist. He was strictly focused on that. He's just backwards looking. He's just reading, Chaucer and, Beowulf. That's all he cares about.
Right.
And if that's the case, how could he possibly have written a book that speaks to the 21st century so deeply and profoundly? That just doesn't make sense to me as a reader or as a literary critic. And that ended up kind of being the guiding question as I looked at, well, what had he read? What really did he think of modernity? And as I did my research, again, this unfolded, this, from the asking of that question, where did The Lord of the Rings really come from, to now is really 10 years of looking at every possible evidence I could find of what he had actually read. Not just what he might have read, but what we can show that he read or owned the book, and finding, golly, he knew a lot of authors. He read widely. He thought seriously about them. Some of the stuff he liked was very surprising, and it made sense of it. So now, as I argue in Tolkien's modern reading, I think it gives us a much better understanding of how The Lord of the Rings is so powerful, because he's like a bridge between the medieval and the modern world. He's drawing lots of stuff from medieval literature, absolutely, but he's doing it and he's making it accessible and powerful, and he's transmuting it. He's transforming it. And he can do that precisely because he's engaged with modernity. He's reading modern literature. He's up to date on the news. He's interested in what's going on in the world. It's that both and that I think is a key insight into Tolkien's creative imagination.
Well, and it's interesting because you really point to his readings, and I've I'm by no means a Tolkien expert, but I have watched several documentaries, and it's interesting. Like a lot of times, people seem to focus on his experience with World War One, his more experiential things that allowed him to take these medieval tropes, these medieval ideas, and focus them. And it sounds to me like you're saying that while that might be true, we're neglecting a whole other aspect of his life, which is what was the main focus of his life, which was literature. It was language, and how that played a role in developing these ideas and the way these books feel and act.
Well, I think we really have to do justice to that important work on his World War One experiences, because that was really significant in starting to make even my research possible. Because John Garth's book, Tolkien and the Great War, is just magisterial. It's just tremendously important in Tolkien scholarship, because up until he wrote that book, really there hadn't even been any attention to Tolkien's involvement in this most massive of modern catastrophes, one of the world wars. People had almost not even really noticed it, which was a huge gap. And one of the things that Garth did, and the people who have then built on his work, was to say, wait. Sure, his research was in medieval literature, but he couldn't avoid this massive engagement with modernity in the form of being in the trenches in World War One. And that, I think, was a really important kind of opening of the door to start to make possible this kind of research, to say, well, look, if his experiences in his own life mean that he's relating with modernity in a powerful way, we should expect that that's not going to be hermetically sealed off in a little compartment labeled the Great War.
Right.
We should expect that he's going to be relating to modernity in the form of literature as well.
Uh-huh. Interesting. Yeah. So let me ask you, what were maybe, you mentioned that there was a few surprises. What were a couple of things that you found that maybe surprised you, or let's just start there. What surprised you about some of the books that he actually enjoyed and read and related to?
Well, one of the things that came to my attention was the way that he has been too often just bundled with C.S. Lewis, as if anything that Lewis liked, Tolkien liked; anything that Lewis didn't like, Tolkien didn't like, as if they were, conjoined twins.
Right.
And they're not. And one of the examples of their differences in taste or differences in views is that Tolkien, for instance, he read with interest the work of James Joyce. He engaged seriously with an early section of Finnegan's Wake. And Finnegan's Wake is about as bafflingly modernist as you can possibly get. And it's something that Lewis just dismissed as, ridiculous. But Tolkien actually wrote a whole page of notes about it, thinking about like what Joyce was doing with language. He took it seriously. And he didn't like all of what Joyce was doing, but I found it very interesting that he was willing to take seriously this very modernist author and what he was trying to accomplish. So that was one surprise. Another surprise was discovering that Tolkien loved science fiction. He named Isaac Asimov as one of his favorite authors. He loved H.G. Wells. He was a reader of American pulp science fiction magazines.
Wow.
Yeah, who knew, right?
Right. So how did he relate to some of, or how did some of these modern writings find its way into the Lord of the Rings, or some into his fiction? How do we find that, and how can what might we look for as we're reading these books?
Well, it's really interesting to note, because Tolkien has often been just sort of labeled as somebody who, was impossible to influence, denied all influences. So again, this was something that I, was investigating. What did he say? Did he admit to any influences? And it turns out that even he, who supposedly never admitted to any influences, directly names quite a few books that specifically influenced his writing. And some of them are books that probably most people have not heard of. So, for example, he names a book called The Marvelous Land of Snurgs by the author E.A. Wick Smith. He names that book as an unconscious source book for the hobbits. And that's a pretty remarkable statement. And so I went back and I read The Marvelous Land of Snurgs. And the Snurgs turn out to be very hobbit-like. They're these small people, very kind of childlike. They have many habits that are very similar to hobbits, including a love of birthdays and feasting. And we might think, oh, it's just a accidental similarity, if it weren't for the fact that Tolkien had read the book and his children loved it before the writing of The Hobbit, and he names it. He calls it an unconscious source book for the hobbits. Again, drawing from it. But again, we want to look at how his creative mind worked, because it's not a question just of, here is a source, source X for item Y in his book. That's a simplistic way of looking at it that's not at all accurate to what his creative imagination was like. He himself used the image of a tree of tales and of a mulch, the leaf mold of his imagination. So really, his reading was like all these leaves falling down on the forest floor and then slowly being digested and pulled up into the tree and put forth into new forms.
Oh, wow.
So we have The Marvelous Land of Snurgs, he names as a source book for the hobbits, but he also names Sinclair Lewis's novel Babbitt as also having an influence on the development of the hobbits, of their name, and also of their personality. And you couldn't really get much more different, because The Marvelous Land of Snurgs is a children's fantasy, and Sinclair Lewis's Babbitt is an American work of serious literary realism. They're very different, and yet
Right.
Tolkien names both of them as material that helped to create the hobbits.
So how much does that speak to his genius, that he's able to, and I'm a musician by training, so I can see this in great geniuses, where they can take ideas that are so disparate and able to, put them together in such a way that it creates a new thing that's bigger and bolder. And I imagine that that's somewhat what Tolkien is doing. And I'm wondering maybe how he's done that, and you've mentioned, some of these books, but is it, or would you attribute to his genius that he's able to just do that?
Yes, I mean, I think that really is where we see very clearly an aspect of his genius, and I think one that hasn't been sufficiently appreciated. So I hope that's one of the things that Tolkien's modern reading can do, is to bring out the way that he absolutely transforms his material. He draws it in and he makes it into something new, and to see the way that his mind is at work is just kind of awe-inspiring. So as I was looking at how did he relate to what he read, I found that sometimes he would have influence in the form of kind of giving him ideas, giving him sort of suggestions, or for what he might do. So, for example, he read a book by the author William Morris, The House of the Wolfings. And then he saw that Morris had used a kind of a mixed form of prose with poetry intermingled, and he decided that he wanted to try that. So that's an example of an influence by getting an idea for how an author might just tackle the form of a story. And we know that he was influenced in this way because he writes to his future wife Edith and says that, inspired by this book by Morris, he's going to try his own hand at a mixed prose and verse story. So we have that kind of influence.
Right.
We also have where he's drawing on what I would say is source material. So as another example of a source that he names, there's a book called The Black Douglas by the author S.R. Crockett, long out of print and forgotten. It's an adventure story. And Tolkien names that and says that there's a scene in it of wolves that was the source material for the warg scene in The Hobbit, where the wolves are, chasing the hobbits and they and Gandalf go up the trees. Well,
Right.
went back and read, Crockett's The Black Douglas, and indeed, there's a scene that's very, very similar to that. And Tolkien, again, he named that and said that the warg scene was derived in part from that scene in Crockett. But what was fascinating is to see the way that Tolkien improved his source material. What he does in The Hobbit is more exciting and more kind of thematically resonant than the source. So again, we see that he doesn't just pick up things, he transforms them, he improves them. And then we also have what I call influence by opposition, where there's a
Okay.
lot of examples where he sees how someone is doing something and he says, no, I can do a better job than that. Or no, I don't like the approach that you take. I'm going to do the opposite. And so we see this, for instance, there's the famous, what's called the wager with him and C.S. Lewis, where they say, there really isn't enough in modern fiction of the kind of thing that we like. We
Right.
want to try our hand at doing something better. And so Lewis sets out to write a space travel story, which comes out of The Silent Planet, and Tolkien sets out to write a time travel story, which he never finished. Very typical Tolkien. It's called The Lost Road. But again, the significance here, Tolkien had to know the science fiction genre very well to be able to say that none of it was really quite hitting what he wanted to hit. He read it, he saw it, and he thought, it's just not doing quite what I wish it were doing. And then he's
Hmm.
going to do something himself. And that's a form of influence by opposition.
Oh, that's great. I so that kind of takes me to another point I wanted to discuss is when we're talking about modern reading or modernism, I guess, we're really, a lot of it can be focused on post Christian ideas and things like that. And I'm wondering how that influenced, what he read and how that influenced his writings, because he is, above all else, a Catholic, a Christian, a believer in Christ, and as you mentioned, an evangelist in helping C.S. Lewis become a Christian. So how did some of these or some of these modern readings or these modern books that may have been uh, anti-Christian or post-Christian, how did that influence what he thought and did?
Well, I think in many ways, Tolkien can be a model for Christians as readers, because he was, as you noted, he was a devout Christian, very serious about his faith throughout his whole life, and very forthright about saying that he was a Christian, that he was a Catholic. But when we look at his reading, he was able to read and enjoy a very wide range of authors, including many that he had pretty fundamental disagreements with. So he's able to engage thoughtfully and indeed to enjoy the work of people that he really differed with pretty fundamentally. And I think it shows, first of all, confidence in his faith. He's not threatened by these authors. It doesn't disturb him. But also a kind of intellectual hospitality, that he's willing to, find what's good in what he's reading and name what's bad. So, for instance, one of the authors that he read is a fantasy author called E.R. Edison, who wrote books such as The Worm Ouroboros, which a few people might have heard of today. It's not many, but some.
I
Um,
haven't.
well, yeah, actually, as a bit of a side note, one of the things about doing this research is that I actually went and read these books. If I found that Tolkien had mentioned something, that he'd read something, I went and read it, tracked it down, got a copy, and that meant reading a lot of books that are long forgotten, long out of print. And
Probably
that was
hard to find. Yes.
Yeah, and that was really helpful, because we can end up with a distorted picture of his context if we only look at the things that have been reprinted or get attention today. If we really want to understand his intellectual context, we need to look at what were the best sellers of his time, and some of them are books that we've never heard of, like E.R. Edison, which probably people haven't heard of. Now, Tolkien really admired Edison's literary works. He said that he had read all of Edison's writings, and certainly he meant, I think, at least all of his fiction fantasy writings. And he called him a great master, of creating imagined worlds. Pretty high praise from Tolkien. But he also said that the philosophy that Edison was putting forth was evil and cruel. So he disagrees pretty fundamentally with the philosophical views that this author holds, but he's able to recognize the literary skill and the craft of the work that he's doing. And I think this is very characteristic of Tolkien's of his mind and his approach. And again, this is that influence by opposition. Can he do better?
Right. Right. And I think it's important. Like if you find somebody who's well crafted that you disagree with fundamentally, that's the challenge is can you match that? Can you are you able to engage with those arguments, whether in literary form or in essay form or however it comes? Can you engage with them and confound them? Because I think it's really important as Christians that we are willing to face ideas head on, and I think that is such an important thing that we can learn from him.
Yeah, I mean, it really shows his fundamental integrity of mind, that if he saw something good, he approved of it. He approved of the good of it. If he thought it was well done, he said it was well done. He didn't, put little ideological tags and say, well, I can't possibly enjoy Edison's fantasy because I disagree with his philosophy. He was very
Yes.
clear, okay, I disagree with the philosophy, but the literary art is good. And I think that takes a strength of mind. It takes a knowledge of one's faith. It takes, a sort of discipline. But I think it's fundamentally what we should be aiming for, and being able to appreciate the good wherever we see it. And conversely, Tolkien was not one to appreciate, or to approve of something that was badly done just because it was by one of his fellow Christians. So, for instance, he took issue with the Catholic writer Hilaire Belloc for some of the things that Belloc had said, very much in praise of the Southern Latin cultures. Belloc was apparently very dismissive of the culture of the North, and Tolkien fired back against that and actually did a lecture challenging Belloc on that. Sadly, the lecture has not survived, but we know that he did it. So he wasn't afraid to challenge people who shared his faith, as well as he wasn't afraid to recognize where someone who didn't share his faith had something that was well done.
That's wonderful. And I want to finish up a little bit with a question, maybe a little bit more personal, Dr. Ordway. It's always true for me whenever I allow a great artist to kind of come into my life and that truly influence me, that it changes me. And I know obviously Tolkien has been a big part of your life. How has this project specifically maybe changed you or helped you, or how has it molded you, and what have you learned from it?
Well, I think fundamentally, when it comes to thinking about the subject of my work, I've come to a much deeper appreciation and admiration for Tolkien. And considering that I had such a high view of him to begin with, that's kind of saying something.
Right.
But I felt, basically 10 years of trying to get into his head, as it were, read what he had read, find out what he thought. It really has helped me just to appreciate him as a man, because I learned a lot about his life as well, got a much more well-rounded picture of him as a person. A lot of things that I didn't realize, filling in the depth. Like for instance, how much he was very attentive to his grandchildren, cared deeply about his relationship with them. He was a very serious, attentive father and grandfather and great grandfather. There's a great story of one of his friends recounting that he came over to visit the elderly Tolkien and found him on hands and knees on the floor playing trains with his great grandson. That's just
heartwarming,
moving. That here we have this great author who is, playing choo-choo trains with a little child, without any sense of that it was below his dignity or anything like that. He had this deep humility, I think, and so that has made him, I think, really a positive model for me as a person, as an academic, that we should take our work seriously, but not take ourselves too seriously. And that's just, because you can study someone and find out that maybe their work is really great, but the person himself isn't maybe as good as you hoped, and you're kind of disappointed.
Absolutely.
And I've had that happen with other figures that I've studied. But it was the opposite for Tolkien. The more that I learned about him, he certainly would have been the first one to say that he wasn't perfect and that he had his faults. But the more that I got to know him, truly, the more I loved and admired him and respected him and thought, what a genuinely good man, like a good man and a great author. And it's been a privilege to sort of kind of get to know him, as it were, through this research.
That's beautifully said. I appreciate that. We're talking to Dr. Holly Ordway, the author of the book Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle Earth Beyond the Middle Ages. I'd really strongly recommend anybody who is a lover of the Lord of the Rings or Tolkien, that this might be a really good book to have to get an idea, to get another idea of where Tolkien was coming from, and maybe a more fuller picture of who he is as a person and as an author. I want to kind of give you the last word. Is there something else that we should mention about your book, about your work, that you'd like to share on our show today?
Well, I would actually just like to point out that this book, although it is an academic book, it's got loads and loads of end notes in it and bibliography, all of that. I'm really focusing on trying to be accessible to really anybody who enjoys Tolkien. So I made it, as much as possible, I made it very readable. I want it to be something that if you enjoy The Lord of the Rings, if you enjoy The Hobbit, then you can pick up this book and find out more about your favorite author and learn about him. And then if you want to, you could also, look at the bibliography and learn more and go deeper. So it's got the academic depth, but I wrote it very intentionally to be engaging for anybody, even if you maybe only seen the films and you've never read the book. Well, maybe this will give you that intriguing idea of like, oh, well, this Tolkien guy, he seems kind of interesting.
Right.
And I'm very pleased about this. There's a photo gallery. There's more than 40 images in it. So it's got pictures. And so that's good fun. So I always just encourage people, it's a book for anybody really who's interested in Tolkien.
Absolutely. And I want to thank you so much for being on my show and talking about your passion, and kind of infusing us with a little bit of that, and so we can get to know J.R.R. Tolkien a little bit better. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.
Well, this is Mike Levitt with And If Love Remains, speaking with Dr. Holly Ordway. There'll be in the show notes links to her upcoming book. Pre-orders are available now, so you can go and get a Christmas present for someone that will come in January. It'll be a great gift, and as well as links to her website. And again, want to thank her for being on the show. This is And If Love Remains.